Why is 95% of Australia mostly uninhabited? Australia is the sixth largest country in the world, and it's so vast that it can fit three countries the size of Germany within its borders. Despite this immense size, 95% of Australia is almost completely empty. About 90% of the population is concentrated in just 0.22% of the country's land area, which is less than 1%. Most people live in five major cities: Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, and Melbourne. In fact, the further you travel from these coastal cities, whether you're heading north, south, east, or west, the less likely you are to find people or even survive in the harsh conditions. So why is so much of Australia left unoccupied? There's an interesting reason behind why most of Australia is uninhabited, which we'll explore later, but in my opinion, it adds a sense of mystery to the country. The real question is, why is 95% of Australia empty? There's a painful historical reason for this, one that history has often tried to conceal from the rest of the world. We all know that the original inhabitants of Australia were the Aboriginal people. But if you look at Australia today, it's predominantly inhabited by white people. So what happened to the Aboriginals? Many of us are aware of what the British did during their colonial rule, how countless people were killed, tortured, and exploited. But we were never really taught about what the so-called civilized British did to the Aboriginal people of Australia. At what level were the Aborigines subjected to genocide and mass persecution? This was a dark phase of Australian history that was hidden from the world. But to understand this, we have to start with the year 1606, when Australia was discovered for the first time. Australia's original inhabitants were the Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders before the colonizers discovered Australia. These indigenous people lived in the jungles. They hunted for food and gathered their medicine and weapons from the land. One unique aspect of their culture was that they didn't view land ownership through the lens of money. They didn't consider themselves to be the owners of their land, and because of this, there was no concept of land fencing in their culture. On the other hand, the 17th century was a time when Europeans were exploring the world to exploit new land resources in the name of trading. During that period, India, Africa, and the USA were also targeted for the same purpose. Meanwhile, on 26 January 1788, some Britishers landed in Botany Bay, an area in modern-day Sydney, and as soon as they learned about the culture in Australia, that no one here owns their land, they saw a significant opportunity. In fact, they also gave a new name to this newly discovered land, Terra Nullius, which means a land that has no king. Initially, the people of Australia welcomed the Britishers very warmly. They were accompanied by their country's criminals, including thieves, robbers, murderers, and rapists, and their primary goal was to turn Australia into a penal colony of Britain. A penal colony is essentially a place where the government sends criminals as punishment and makes them work. So from 1788 to 1868, which is around a century, the British sent 162,000 convicts there, but the indigenous people had no knowledge of this. Especially at the start, they didn't realize that the British were establishing a penal colony. And how did they even find out? The British brought them together, promised them progress, and with their consent, initially only discussed a small portion of land and secured it. The British basically wanted to establish their own base, similar to what they had done in India through the East India Company. The British arrived in Australia with two major issues. First, they brought life-threatening diseases to which the secluded native Australians had no immunity. For example, fresh bronchitis, measles, scarlet fever, chickenpox, smallpox, and whooping cough. None of these diseases were present in Australia or fairly before, and as a result, the population had no natural defenses. Consequently, these diseases spread rapidly in Sydney. Within a year, 50% of the population died from smallpox. The same situation occurred in the Port Phillip area, where 50% of the population was wiped out overnight due to the disease. And year after year, these diseases continued to kill people. Even though the British had the cure, yet they mostly left everyone to die. In fact, a similar situation occurred in India in the 1900s when diseases like cholera, smallpox, and malaria spread. More than 3 million people died in India. The British had vaccines to treat these diseases, but they never treated the Indian population and simply let them die. The same fate befell the indigenous people of Australia. Secondly, as I mentioned, the British initially took only a small amount of land. But then gradually, to take over Australia's land, they began to build fences. In a short time, these people spread to Curran, Hobart, Melbourne, and Brisbane. As the fencing expanded, the work previously done willingly by the Australian indigenous people started to be imposed upon them. In the areas where the British had built fences, Australians were forced to hunt, use clean water, and obtain food from there. Within a few years, the British began ruling over the local population. They forced Australians to work in the fields and subjected their helpless wives and children to rape. They went so far as to target pregnant women, forcing them into the deep sea to die for pearls, showing no concern for the women or their children. Gradually, this atrocity escalated to such an extent that in 1795, the people of Australia revolted. A war began between them, which continued for the next 100 years. During this time, many small and large battles were also fought. While all wars are known to bring destruction, this prolonged conflict in Australia resulted in such devastation that 90% of its population died in a flash, from a population of 300,000 to 750,000 people by 1900. Only 30,000 to 75,000 people were left. This population decline was exclusively among the indigenous people of Australia, In fact, even after the discovery of Australia, over the past 3 centuries, people from many other countries continue to trade there, like Germans, Chinese, or even Japanese. With the influx of these new populations, Australia's total population grew to 5 million. Yet from this number, nearly 90% of the indigenous Australians died, but the British didn't stop there. They quickly found another way to continue their campaign of destruction by sending Australians to fight in World War I, where they also sent convicts and their families from Britain. In 1914, during World War I, the British sent 1 out of every 5 Australians to Europe to fight. According to Australia's renowned Australian War Memorial, the British deployed 416,809 men to the war, but 40% of them did not return. This caused a significant decline in Australia's male population. Meanwhile, in 1942, their involvement in World War II began once again. Since Australia had become a British colony and was fighting on the side of Britain, many Australians died in this conflict as well. Australia faced numerous air attacks. In fact, between 1942 and 1943, Japan launched over 90 attacks on the northern parts of Australia. Both wars had a significant impact on the population, particularly reducing the male population. Additionally, beyond these historical conflicts, a policy played a crucial role in controlling Australia's population. As mentioned earlier, the British had come to Australia with the intention of turning it into another Britain. This is why they introduced the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901. This act is also known as the White Australia Policy. The primary aim of this policy was to prevent non-whites, such as Asian immigrants and native Australians, from entering the country, ensuring that only the British could rule. Consequently, there was little interest in the growth of any ethnic group other than white Australians. This is also a key reason why the majority of Australia's population today is of white descent. To summarize, when the British arrived, 2 major things occurred. First, diseases spread, causing mass deaths, and second, a century-long internal conflict led to the extinction of 90% of Australia's indigenous population. Additionally, World War I and World War II had a substantial impact on the male population. And the final blow came from the Immigration Act, which allowed an influx of migrants and suddenly halted the growth of the Australian population. Currently, Australia has a population of 26 million, but the native Australian population makes up only 3.8%, meaning there are just 1 million native Australians living there today. This number is even smaller than the population of a medium-sized city in many European countries. So far, we've explored how 90% of the indigenous population was lost before Australia became a nation. Now the question is, why is 95% of Australia still empty despite the increase in overall population? Why is the majority of Australia's population concentrated in just 5 cities? There's another significant reason behind this. It's Australia's geographical location that plays a major role. Every year, the country experiences such heavy rainfall that survival becomes extremely challenging. First, let's understand Australia's unique geography. If you look at the map closely, Australia is divided into 3 major landforms. First, the Western Plateau, which covers about 2/3 of the country and consists mostly of desert, making it uninhabitable for humans. Second, the Central Lowlands, which is characterized by low-lying areas, but the water here is salty and not suitable for agriculture or human use. Lastly, the Eastern Highlands, which stretch from the Cape York Peninsula to the Bass Strait, consists of mountainous regions and lush forests. Australia experiences 3 extreme weather conditions: desert heat, floods, and cyclones. But why is this the case? Consequently, 70% of Australia is desert and prone to drought, which results in a loss of $1.1 billion each year for the country's cropping industry, for example. Queensland, one of Australia's major regions, was declared a drought-affected state by the government in 2017. To understand why Australia has so much salty water, let's examine the Central Lowlands. The soil and rocks in this region, which are millions of years old, have naturally high salinity levels. When these rocks break down, the salt spreads. Lastly, let's explore why Australia faces so many floods and cyclones. Australia is located just south of the equator, where direct sunlight causes extremely high temperatures. The Earth rotates from west to east, which causes strong trade winds to flow in the opposite direction, from east to west. As a result of these conditions, the warm water of the Pacific Ocean moves with the winds toward the east coast of Australia, where it leads to cloud formation. Additionally, the Great Dividing Range blocks these clouds from moving further, causing rain in this region and creating a green area. This represents one scenario of rainfall in Australia. In another scenario, the warm water flowing from the Pacific Ocean accumulates in large quantities in the east, while cold water rushes towards the Americas beneath it. This creates a stark contrast, resulting in even stronger trade winds. Here's the situation in eastern Australia. Clouds are forming and the mountains are preventing them from moving further, but then strong winds come into play, leading to flood-like conditions that can become extreme and even spawn cyclones. In fact, it's not uncommon for Australia to experience 2 to 3 cyclones each year, which can be quite destructive. To sum it up, Australia's history has prevented its population from growing. Today's population must contend with the country's extreme climate conditions, and the geography of Australia is a third major factor. As we've seen, survival in many parts of Australia is extremely challenging, and that's why the majority of the population is concentrated in just a few areas. So that's the story behind Australia's 95% vacancy. See you next time. Until then, take care, goodbye.